John split the last knot of cedar, the axe head biting deep into the grain with a satisfying thud that echoed through the snow-laden stillness of the Pacific Northwest forest. The chill, a familiar companion, bit at his exposed skin, but his calloused hands moved with an practiced efficiency honed over years of self-imposed solitude. He was a man of 48, his lean frame a testament to the unforgiving rhythm of his existence. Every day brought the same cycle: rise before dawn, check traps, chop wood, hunt for small game, maintain the integrity of his remote cabin. This life, stripped bare of the complexities he'd once known, was a refuge, a stark canvas where the ghosts of a forgotten world held no sway. His face, a roadmap of sun and wind, was framed by a thick, grizzled beard, and his blue-gray eyes, sharp and observant, missed little in the ancient woods he called home. Winter was tightening its icy grip, promising months of brutal cold and an even deeper isolation, a prospect John usually welcomed like an old, trusted friend. He found a certain stark comfort in the silence, the vast, unbroken expanse of wilderness reflecting the quietude he cultivated within himself. The weight of his own past, a burden he'd deliberately left behind, felt lighter here, diffused by the sheer scale of the mountains and the relentless flow of the river a mile to the west. He preferred the company of the towering pines and the elusive deer to the unpredictable nature of people. His cabin, a sturdy, unassuming structure built from felled logs, was more than just shelter. It was a fortress against memory, a bastion of hard-won peace. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in the wind, the language of the tracks in the snow, the almost imperceptible changes in the forest's mood. This knowledge, hard-earned through trial and error, was his currency, his shield. He trusted the wild more than he trusted any man. One frigid evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, a faint, almost imperceptible whimpering disturbed the profound quiet that had settled over the cabin. John, already near the warmth of his hearth, paused, his hand still on the cast-iron kettle. The sound, fragile and lost, pricked at a dormant corner of his hardened heart. He waited, listening, convinced it was just the wind or a trick of his own mind. But then it came again, a desperate, reedy cry, closer this time, just beyond the thick timber door. He reached for his rifle, a worn but reliable Winchester, and cautiously unbarred the door, stepping out into the biting cold and the deepening snow. There, in the dim, fading light, lay a sight that defied all logic, a tableau of impossible despair. A massive tigress, a creature that had no business existing in these North American woods, lay sprawled in the snow, her powerful body clearly wounded, her breath misting heavily in ragged gasps. Blood, stark crimson against the pristine white, stained the snow beneath her flank. Beside her, a tiny, shivering cub, no bigger than a house cat, mewled piteously, its eyes still clouded with the blur of infancy. The mother, with a final, agonizing effort, nudged her offspring forward, pushing it with her nose towards John's cabin door. Her large, intelligent eyes, filled with an ancient, primal plea, met his across the short, snow-covered distance. In that gaze, John saw not aggression, but a profound, desperate trust, a silent offering. Then, with a shudder that ran through her entire body, she turned, a ghost in the gathering twilight, and disappeared into the encroaching darkness, leaving behind only the fresh trail of her blood and the tiny, helpless cub. John stood frozen, the warmth of his cabin a mere few feet behind him, feeling like a distant, irrelevant concept compared to the stark reality outside. A tigress, here, in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest? The sheer impossibility of it hammered at his mind, vying for space with the chilling certainty of the mother's fate. He knew, with an instinct as old as the mountains themselves, that she had gone off to die, a supreme sacrifice to ensure her cub's survival. This impossible gift, this tiny, fragile life, and the equally impossible responsibility that came with it, landed squarely and heavily on his shoulders. He was faced with an immediate, terrifying dilemma. Abandon the cub to the certain death of the unforgiving wild, to the cold and the hunger that would surely claim it before morning, or take in a creature that could and would grow into a formidable, dangerous predator, forever altering his solitary existence. His peace, his carefully constructed isolation would be shattered, replaced by an unpredictable, perilous future. The cub whimpered again, a small, mournful sound that seemed to cut through the frigid air and lodge itself deep within him. He thought of his own past, the reasons he sought this solitude, the mistakes he'd made, the lives he'd failed to protect. Now, a silent, dying mother had placed another life in his hands, a trust he hadn't asked for, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. The choice felt monumental, a fork in the path of his existence. The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity, he muttered to himself, the words of an old book echoing in his mind. The cub's whimper, so small and fragile against the vast, indifferent wilderness, was a sound John hadn't heard in decades, a sound of utter dependence, of life clinging to the edge. He stood there, the cold seeping into his bones, but it was a deeper chill, one of profound unease that truly settled within him. The tigress's eyes, those ancient, pleading pools of amber, had imprinted themselves on his memory. They spoke of a sacrifice so complete, a trust so absolute, that to turn away would be to betray something fundamental, something that resonated with the forgotten humanity buried deep within him. He glanced at the tiny, shivering bundle of fur, then back at the dark, blood-streaked path where the mother had vanished. The choice, stark and brutal, demanded an immediate answer. With a heavy sigh that misted in the frigid air, John lowered his rifle, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth he was about to invite into his life. He knelt, his movements stiff from the cold and the internal battle, and gently, almost reverently, scooped up the cub. It was surprisingly light, a mere handful of striped fur and trembling bone, its warmth barely registering through his thick gloves. The cub's mewl intensified, a sound of both fear and tentative hope, as it instinctively burrowed into the warmth of his chest. Its breath, hot and surprisingly sweet, ghosted against his coat. The smell of wildcat, musky, earthy, and undeniably potent, clung to him instantly, a new scent in the otherwise sterile air of his solitude. He carried it inside, closing the heavy door with a quiet click that seemed to seal his fate, separating him from the dying mother and the life he had known. The cabin, once a sanctuary of quiet order, was instantly transformed. The cub, which John would later name Leela, after the faint lilac hue he imagined in her developing eyes, was a whirlwind of need. His first task was warmth. He carefully placed her near the hearth, wrapping her in a soft, old wool blanket he usually reserved for the coldest nights. Her tiny body shivered violently, and he could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his palm. Next, food. What did a tiger cub eat? He had no milk, no specialized formula. His pantry held dried meat, flour, and coffee. Desperation led him to dilute some evaporated milk with melted snow, warming it carefully over the fire. He fashioned a makeshift nipple from a piece of deer hide, poking a tiny hole in it with his hunting knife. Leela, at first, was confused, batting at the strange object with clumsy paws. But hunger, primal and insistent, soon took over. She latched on, suckling with an intensity that surprised him, her small body trembling with effort. The sight of her, so vulnerable and utterly dependent, stirred something profound within John, a protective instinct he thought had long atrophied. He watched her for hours that first night, sleepless, feeding her every few hours, listening to her soft, contented snores, and the occasional, almost imperceptible twitch of her whiskers. The cabin was no longer just his. It now housed a secret, a living, breathing testament to a dying mother's trust. The initial days were a chaotic struggle against ignorance and instinct. John, a man accustomed to the predictable patterns of the wild and his own routine, found himself utterly unprepared for the demands of a tiger cub. Leela was a creature of boundless energy, even in her infancy.
She explored every inch of the cabin, her wobbly gait slowly giving way to a more confident stride. She gnawed on everything, the legs of his table, the corners of his books, even his worn leather boots. He learned quickly that her tiny claws, though small, were incredibly sharp, leaving telltale scratches on his wooden floor and furniture. His days, once defined by the hunt and the rhythm of manual labor, now revolved around Leela's feeding schedule, her naps, and her endless need for stimulation. He spent hours fashioning crude toys from pine cones and scraps of hide, watching her pounce and stalk with an innate grace that belied her size. He discovered that tiger cubs, much like house cats, were fastidious, and he painstakingly taught her to use a designated patch of sand in a corner of the cabin, a compromise he never imagined making. The biggest challenge was food. As Leela grew, her appetite became voracious.
Small game from his traps, rabbits, squirrels, grouse, barely sated her. He began to hunt larger prey, deer and elk, with a new urgency, not just for his own survival, but for hers. He learned to butcher the animals meticulously, ensuring Leela received the necessary nutrients, even grinding bones for calcium. The act of feeding her, watching her tear at raw meat with growing ferocity, was a constant reminder of the wild nature he was nurturing within his walls. He saw the shift in her eyes, from the cloudy innocence of a newborn to the sharp, intelligent gaze of a predator. He spent hours observing her, studying her movements, her growls, her playful nips that were slowly becoming more powerful. He read every book he possessed on big cats, devouring information on their behavior, their needs, their instincts. His cabin, once a symbol of his escape from the world, now became a laboratory, a nursery, a sanctuary for a creature that shouldn't exist here. Weeks turned into months, and Leela grew with astonishing speed. Her soft, cub-like fur gave way to a sleek, dense coat, the black stripes on her vibrant orange-gold fur becoming sharper, more defined. Her paws, once comically large, now seemed perfectly proportioned to her rapidly lengthening limbs. She moved with an elegant, liquid grace, a silent hunter even in play. The cabin became too small for her burgeoning energy, and John began to take her on carefully supervised excursions into the surrounding forest. He taught her to stalk, to use the cover of the undergrowth, to read the wind. These weren't lessons in cruelty, but in survival, in understanding the delicate balance of predator and prey. He never allowed her to kill, not yet, but he honed her instincts, watching with a mixture of awe and trepidation as the magnificent beast within her began to assert itself. Their bond wasn't one of ownership, but a fragile, unspoken partnership, built on trust forged in the harsh crucible of the wilderness. He was her protector, her provider, her teacher, and she, in her own way, was his. Her rumbling purr, a deep vibration that resonated through his chest when she leaned against him, was a comfort he hadn't known he craved. Her playful swat, powerful enough to knock him off balance, was always tempered with an almost human understanding, a careful restraint. She would watch him chop wood, her head cocked, her eyes following the arc of the axe, occasionally letting out a soft chuff, a sound of approval. He found himself talking to her, telling her about his day, about the changing seasons, about the silent weight of his past. She was his confidant, his silent companion, the only living soul who shared his isolated world. But as Leela grew, so did the danger of her discovery. A full-grown tigress in the North American wilderness was an anomaly that would draw unwanted, potentially deadly attention. John became increasingly vigilant, his senses heightened, constantly scanning the forest for any sign of human intrusion. He meticulously covered their tracks whenever they ventured out, using fallen branches and freshly disturbed earth to obscure Leela's distinctive paw prints. He learned to anticipate her roars, which, as she matured, became deep, resonant calls that could carry for miles through the valleys. He would distract her, calm her, or guide her away from areas where her calls might echo too loudly.
He started to feel the subtle shifts in the forest's atmosphere, the almost imperceptible changes that signaled human presence. The occasional distant gunshot, the faint scent of wood smoke that wasn't his own, the sudden silence of the local wildlife, all became harbingers of potential disaster. Rumors, like tendrils of smoke, began to circulate in the nearest small town, a collection of weathered buildings and weary faces, a 3-day trek from John's cabin. He only visited the general store once every few months for essential supplies, but even then, he heard the whispers. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled trapper with eyes like a hawk, spoke of tracks unlike any bear or cougar he'd ever seen, prints too large, too perfectly symmetrical. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner, mentioned her nephew, a young hunter, claiming he'd heard a growl that shook the trees while out deer hunting, a sound that wasn't from any local animal. The local ranger, a by-the-book type named Miller, dismissed it as tall tales or misidentification, but John saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. These were not just idle gossip, they were fragments of truth, dangerous truths that were slowly coalescing. John felt the walls closing in, the delicate balance of his life with Lila hanging by a thread. He knew his time was running out. He began to fortify his cabin, reinforcing the windows and door, creating hidden caches for supplies. He practiced his shooting more frequently, his aim as steady as ever, but now with a grim determination he hadn't possessed before. He was preparing for a war to protect the silent promise he had made. One crisp morning, the telltale signs appeared, stark and undeniable. Not far from his usual trapline, where he'd found a freshly caught rabbit just the day before, he saw them. Unfamiliar boot prints. They were not the heavy, practical boots of a local trapper or a casual hiker. These were lighter, more tactical, with a distinct, aggressive tread pattern. He knelt, examining them closely, his jaw tightening. A few yards away, partially buried in the leaves, lay a discarded cigarette butt. It wasn't his brand, nor was it any brand he recognized from the few locals who ventured this deep into the woods. It was a high-end, filtered cigarette, foreign and out of place. His traps, usually undisturbed, showed subtle signs of tampering, not tripped, but carefully examined, almost as if someone was assessing his methods, his presence. They weren't just after game, they were after something specific, something valuable, something that had left a scent trail only a certain kind of hunter would follow. A cold certainty settled in John's gut. They were hunting Lila. His solitary peace was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a looming confrontation. He had to protect her. He spent the next few days in a heightened state of alert, moving through the forest like a ghost, his senses extended. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, a potential threat. Lila, too, seemed to sense the change. Her playful demeanor was replaced by a more watchful, cautious stance. Her ears constantly swiveled, her nose testing the wind, her low growls more frequent, more resonant. She was aware, in her own primal way, that their sanctuary was under threat. John knew these men weren't casual hunters. They were professionals, likely poachers, driven by profit. He had encountered their kind before, in another life, another place. They were ruthless, efficient, and dangerous. He spent hours patrolling the perimeter of his territory, setting up crude tripwires and warning signals, carefully stacked stones that would tumble, taut fishing lines that would vibrate a small bell. He sharpened his axe, cleaned his rifle, and loaded extra magazines. He was ready. The climax erupted during a fierce snowstorm, a swirling vortex of white that descended upon the forest with brutal suddenness. The world was reduced to a few feet of visibility, the wind howling like a banshee through the pines. It was the perfect cover for the poachers and the perfect trap for John. He had heard them approaching, not through sight, but through the subtle shift in the wind's song, carrying the faint scent of human sweat and gun oil. Two hardened poachers, their figures vague shapes in the blizzard, had cornered Lila near John's cabin. She was a magnificent, powerful beast now, nearly full-grown,
her stripes a blur against the snow, her roars echoing the loyalty she felt, a deep, resonant challenge that vibrated through the very ground. John, armed with his hunting rifle and fueled by a protective fury he hadn't felt in decades, burst from the cabin, a silent, determined specter in the storm. "Leave her be!" he roared, his voice raw, cutting through the wind. The poachers, surprised by his sudden appearance, turned, their faces grim, their eyes cold. Silas, the leaner, more calculating of the two, raised his rifle. "Step aside, old man. She's worth more than your whole damn cabin." Mitch, the bulkier one, moved to flank Leela, a tranquilizer dart gun held steady. Leela, sensing the imminent threat, crouched low, her muscles coiling, a low, guttural growl rumbling in her chest, her eyes fixed on the men. A tense standoff ensued, a brutal dance of wits and primal instinct in the swirling snow. John didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the snow near Silas's feet, kicking up a plume of white. The sound cracked through the storm, momentarily startling the men. "I won't ask again," John warned, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Silas, seeing the unwavering resolve in John's eyes, knew this wasn't an empty threat. He lunged, not at John, but at Leela, attempting to fire the dart gun. John reacted with the speed of a seasoned woodsman, tackling Silas, sending them both tumbling into a snowdrift. The rifle clattered away, lost in the whiteout. Mitch, momentarily stunned, hesitated, then moved to intervene, but Leela was quicker. With a powerful swipe of her paw, claws sheathed but impact devastating, she knocked the dart gun from Mitch's hand, sending it skittering across the snow. Her roar, a deafening explosion of sound, vibrated through the air, a clear declaration of her allegiance. During the desperate struggle, as John wrestled with Silas in the snow, he managed to disarm the poacher, twisting the man's arm until he cried out, releasing a small, advanced tracking device that fell from a hidden pocket in his tactical vest. It wasn't just a simple GPS tracker, it was a sophisticated microchip reader, the kind used by researchers or government agencies. The device, small and sleek, glinted faintly in the meager light. Silas, panicked and winded, his face contorted in fear as Lila circled, her growls a constant threat, blurted out a crucial detail, his voice ragged. "She's worth millions! An experimental lineage, thought lost! You don't understand what you have!" The words hit John like a physical blow, colder than the snow. Lila wasn't just a tigress, an anomaly. She was a global secret, a creature of immense scientific and financial value, perhaps an escaped specimen from a highly clandestine research facility, a private collection, or even a military project. The pieces clicked into place. Her unusual size, her uncanny intelligence, the poacher's professionalism, the advanced tech. This wasn't just about a wild animal. It was about something far more complex, far more dangerous. John, with Lila's help, her powerful presence and guttural warnings more effective than any weapon, managed to drive off the poachers. Silas and Mitch, bruised and defeated, stumbled back into the storm, their mission a failure, their secret exposed. But the victory was hollow. The revelation of Lila's true nature changed everything. She was not just a wild animal he'd rescued, a creature of the forest he had bonded with. She was a living, breathing secret, hunted by powerful, unseen forces that would stop at nothing to reclaim her. His responsibility had deepened beyond mere survival. It was now a matter of global intrigue, a profound ethical dilemma, a question of a creature's right to freedom versus humanity's insatiable desire to control, to exploit, to own. The quiet life he had built, the peace he had found, was irrevocably shattered. The wilderness, once his sanctuary, had become a battleground, and he, an unwitting guardian, stood at its heart. The days following the confrontation were a blur of intense thought and frantic preparation. John dismantled the poacher's tracking device, studying its components with a grim fascination. The technology was far beyond anything he'd seen in the civilian market, confirming Silas's desperate confession.
Lila was indeed special, dangerously so. The implications weighed heavily on him, pressing down like the winter snow. He understood now that the poachers were just the first wave, the crude vanguard. The forces truly interested in Lila would be far more sophisticated, far more relentless. He imagined government agencies, private corporations, wealthy collectors, all with the resources and reach to scour the earth for such a prize. His cabin, once his impenetrable refuge, now felt like a glaring beacon, a temporary shield against an inevitable storm. He began to pack, but not for a resupply trip. He meticulously sorted through his possessions, keeping only the absolute essentials: his rifle and ammunition, a few changes of durable clothing, a compact first aid kit, a small cooking pot, and a few packets of dried food. He gathered his maps, marking potential escape routes: deeper, more remote valleys, higher ridges, forgotten caves, places even he rarely ventured. He thought of his past, the reasons he had sought solitude. He had fled a world of complications, of demands, of the painful weight of responsibility for others.
Now, that world had found him again, dragging him back into its intricate, perilous web, all for the sake of a creature whose life he had inadvertently saved. John faced an agonizing moral decision. Should he reveal Lila's existence to the authorities, knowing it would mean her inevitable capture and a life of study or, worse, captivity? He pictured her in a sterile laboratory, poked and prodded, or confined to a zoo enclosure, her wild spirit broken. The thought was a searing pain in his chest. Or should he disappear with her, becoming an outlaw, living a life of constant evasion, a ghost in the wilderness, to ensure her freedom and protect her secret? He had to weigh his own desire for peace, for the simple, quiet life he had cultivated, against the profound, silent promise he'd made to a dying mother in the snow. That promise, unspoken but deeply understood, was a sacred trust, a bond forged in desperation and sacrifice. He remembered the Tigress's eyes, those deep pools of ancient wisdom and desperate hope. He couldn't betray that. He couldn't betray Lila. He spent a sleepless night, the fire crackling softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lila lay curled at the foot of his bed, a magnificent, purring sentinel. He reached out, running his hand through her thick fur, feeling the powerful muscles beneath. She chuffed softly, pressing her head into his palm, her eyes, intelligent and trusting, meeting his. In that moment, the choice became clear. Not easy, but undeniably clear. His life was no longer his own. It was intertwined with hers, a destiny woven by a desperate act of maternal love. He was her last hope, her only chance at a life lived free. John made his choice. With a heavy heart but a resolute spirit, he began the arduous task of dismantling his cabin, piece by painstaking piece. He didn't just pack, he erased. He took down the log walls, carefully stacking the timber. He pulled up the floorboards, scattered ashes from his hearth, and covered the foundation with earth and leaves, letting the snow further obscure any trace of his long occupancy. He dismantled his traps, packed away his tools, and covered his fire pit. He worked tirelessly, driven by a fierce determination, his hands aching, his body weary, but his mind sharp. He knew that any lingering sign could lead those hunting Lila straight to them. He was becoming a phantom, a whisper in the wind, and Lila, his magnificent shadow, would be with him. Their departure was as silent as their arrival had been. Under the cover of a moonless night, with a fresh blanket of snow obscuring their tracks, John and Lila vanished deeper into the wilderness. He carried a heavy pack, his rifle slung across his back, and Lila walked silently beside him, her powerful form melting into the shadows of the ancient trees. Their bond, forged in desperation and trust, became the foundation of a new, dangerous, yet profoundly meaningful life. He became a ghost, her silent guardian, forever bound to the magnificent beast whose mother had entrusted him with her legacy.
The man who sought solitude found himself with a purpose far grander and more perilous than he could have ever imagined, embracing a destiny woven with the untamed heart of the wild. They moved through the landscape as one, a man and a tiger, their survival dependent on each other, their future uncertain, but their resolve unwavering. John had traded his quiet peace for a life of constant vigilance, of perpetual motion, of endless hiding. But as he glanced at Leela, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight, he felt a profound sense of rightness. He was protecting something truly precious, something wild and free, and in doing so, he had rediscovered a part of himself he thought was long lost. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and indifferent, but now it was also their protector, their accomplice, their only home.
Their journey had just begun, a silent promise echoing through the ancient trees, a testament to the extraordinary lengths a man would go to honor a trust bestowed by the wild itself. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying their secret deeper into the heart of the untamed world, where a man and his tiger would carve out a new existence, forever bound by fate and an unbreakable, fierce loyalty. Every rustle, every distant sound was now a potential threat, sharpening John's senses to an almost primal level. He learned to distinguish the natural sounds of the forest from the unnatural, the distant snap of a twig from a deer from the deliberate crunch of a human boot. His hearing became so acute he could often hear Leela's soft breathing even when she walked several paces ahead of him, her movements so fluid and silent that she seemed to glide over the snow. Their new existence was one of constant adaptation. John, who had thought himself an expert in wilderness survival, now pushed his skills to their absolute limits. He no longer had the luxury of a permanent shelter. They lived in a succession of temporary camps, hidden rock overhangs, dense thickets, or makeshift lean-tos constructed from fallen branches and pine boughs, always chosen for their strategic advantage, a clear line of sight, a concealed escape route, or a position difficult to approach unnoticed. He learned to build fires that produced minimal smoke, or to forego them entirely, relying on heavy furs and Leela's body heat for warmth during the brutal nights. Food became an even greater challenge. Hunting for two, especially when one was a growing tiger, required immense effort and cunning. John became a master tracker, reading the subtle signs of the forest, anticipating the movements of elk, deer, and even larger game. He often worked in tandem with Leela, her superior senses and raw power complementing his human intellect and precision with the rifle. There were times when Leela, with a flash of instinct, would bring down prey John had been stalking for hours, sharing the kill with a possessive pride that warmed his heart. He ensured she ate first, always. The bond between them deepened into something truly extraordinary, transcending the boundaries of species. They communicated not with words, but with an intricate language of glances, chuffs, growls, and subtle shifts in posture. John could read Leela's moods, her playful curiosity, her cautious vigilance, her rare moments of anxiety. And Leela, in turn, seemed to understand John's unspoken commands, his silent warnings, the nuanced emotions that flickered across his weathered face. She became his shadow, his protector, his early warning system. Her powerful senses, far superior to his own, often alerted him to danger long before he could perceive it. A low growl, a twitch of her ears, a sudden stillness in her magnificent body. These were her signals, and John learned to trust them implicitly. She would often position herself strategically around their camp, a living, breathing perimeter, her presence alone a formidable deterrent. Life on the run was physically grueling and emotionally taxing. John was constantly tired, his muscles aching, his mind perpetually alert. The weight of his secret, the knowledge that powerful forces were likely still searching for Leela, was a constant companion. He imagined them, these unseen adversaries, with their advanced technology, their tracking dogs, their relentless pursuit. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. He had to be smarter, faster, more invisible.
He learned to use the environment to his advantage, crossing icy rivers to break scent trails, traversing treacherous mountain passes that humans rarely dared to attempt, always pushing deeper into the most inhospitable parts of the wilderness. He knew that true safety lay not in fighting, but in disappearing, in becoming one with the untamed landscape.
Months bled into seasons, and Lila reached her full maturity, a magnificent specimen of her kind. Her coat gleamed with health, her muscles rippled beneath her skin, and her roars, when she allowed them to escape, were thunderous declarations of her power. She was a creature of breathtaking beauty and terrifying strength, a testament to John's unwavering care and the wild spirit that thrived within her. Their journey led them through ancient, untouched forests where trees reached towards the sky like colossal sentinels, across vast, windswept plateaus and into the silent, snow-capped peaks of the mountains. They encountered other wildlife, bears, wolves, cougars, but Lila's sheer size and formidable presence usually kept them at a respectful distance.